So, back in the day in high school, being the typical antisocial nerd I was and still am, I spent a good amount of time at the library down the street. What did I do? Did I do anything productive, like, say, homework like I should have? No. I went straight to the graphic novel section to look at superheroes beating the shit out of each other. I mean, come on, superheroes are so cool. They have those really unique and colorful costumes, they got dumb superpowers that feed into your power fantasy. There's even that entire cinematic universe that gets shoved down your throat on a yearly basis that's owned by that one company that's basically the monopoly on entertainment. Overall, superheroes are just so widespread and interesting, they've become something of modern mythological heroes. Figures who embody everything we either like or dislike about humanity. Some supernatural power slapped on and thrown into entire epics where entire bookshelves can be filled by Batman alone. And yet, I have to say, I just can't enjoy this medium anymore. As a bit of a disclaimer, this video isn't really meant to be an argument on why you shouldn't read comics. I firmly believe everyone is entitled to what kind of entertainment they enjoy, and if you've consistently read comics for the past few decades, or if you are just getting into them now, then that's perfectly fine. That being said, I also believe that no medium is without criticism in order to improve. And believe me, there are a lot of things mainstream comic book companies can do to improve. With all that said, let's go over some of the most infuriating characteristics of superhero comics that literally ruined the medium for me. I want to briefly go over the single superhero who is both near and dear to my heart, Green Lantern. So back when I was in that library, out of all the comics that they had trade paperback collections of, the most complete series they had was Geoff Johns' Green Lantern run. And I can confidently say that it was the best and most tightly written comics I have ever read. It went from Hal Jordan's Resurrection, which is also a soft reboot of the character, all the way to Wrath of the First Lantern. The whole story was barely even a conventional superhero narrative. Instead of a new dumb monster for that week, there were entire dedicated story arcs. Instead of taking place in Gotham or Metropolis, you got stories that took place on completely different planets. This version of Green Lantern as a whole was far less comparable to Batman or Superman, but something more akin to Star Wars. It was an entire sci-fi epic with gorgeous art and stories that span a cosmic scale. And then Geoff Johns' run ended and I completely lost interest in the character. To truly outline just how unfortunate this is, within the very end of the run, we had, spoilers by the way, Hal Jordan and Carol Ferris's marriage and growing old together, Jon Stewart's marriage, Guy Gardner opening up his own space bar, Kyle Rayner becoming actual fucking space Jesus, and my all-time favorite villain Sinestro getting a redemption arc. It was the most tightly written conclusion to one of the best sci-fi epics I've ever seen, and I felt happy knowing I could put the book down having seen my beloved heroes hit the most appropriate end to their arcs. Even better, DC introduced not one but two new characters to pick up the title of being the main Green Lantern, Simon Baz and Jessica Cruz, and they're pretty rad. Then a new team picked up the book and took a brown construct shit all over it. From what I've seen occur, Sinestro is evil again, Hal and Carol split up for the 5th time in their history, Kyle and Carol get together for some fucking reason, Hal becomes a god of willpower or something. If this sounds like I have no idea what's going on or hell even inaccurate, then you're completely right. I thought I knew how Hal's story ended and was excited to see how Simon and Jessica would pick up afterwards. I would dare say that for comics it made too much damn sense. Now, keep in mind, as you may have guessed, I have not read anything recent from Green Lantern, and although this may sound like me invoking the classic old thing good, new thing bad, I want you to know that I actually have no real problem with these stories that I haven't read. Rather, this very swift change in direction and focus isn't character assassination of Green Lantern Hal Jordan, but rather a new actor in a similar costume trying to sell me that he's Hal Jordan. The thing about it is that what I enjoyed in reading the Green Lantern comics, from its settings to its characters to its ideas, just wasn't the same when it was a new voice. This is by no means meant to say that the new voices are inadequate, but believe it or not, people have different styles of writing, different visions. Although all are valid, some voices might not attract the same audiences, which happened to me. And to be honest, I feel like this is my biggest issue with comic book runs, and the mentality of giving a character to multiple artists. So let's talk about this. Why do superheroes get different writers and artists over time? Well, it's because these characters aren't owned by a single author, they're owned by a business. Here's the thing about a character with a long history. They tend to have very rehashed stories. For instance, how many times is Batman going to throw the Joker into Arkham? How many times is Spider-Man going to save New York? Why, every time of course, but during every event where Batman and the Joker face off in a climactic physical and philosophical confrontation, what is actually added to the narrative of Batman as a whole? Not much really. This repetition in themes and story beats ultimately comes from the fact that every run, no matter who is working on the book, ultimately must maintain a very specific status quo. And I will say that although these individual stories are great in isolation, such as Batman's Hush or The Killing Joke, keeping up with an individual character's ever-expanding history can become tiring since everything returns to that status quo. A good example of this that I can think of is the case with Spider-Man and One More Day. If you know anyone who's even mildly interested in comics, I can bet you've heard about how universally hated One More Day is. Let me explain. The basis of Peter Parker's story has always been about how he's a dumb and dorky kid, and the main growth that revolves around him is Peter learning to grow up and use his powers for good rather than his own personal gain. The issue is that if Peter ever actually grew out of being a dumb, naive kid, then that's basically it. That's the conclusion of Spider-Man. What One More Day essentially did was to ensure that Peter never grows up. He's not allowed to become a reasonable adult. He's not allowed to settle down and live a happy married life. He's not allowed to start a family. Instead, Peter is forced into the status of petulant man-child who can't maintain a stable relationship or even own a successful company because that would go against the image of Peter as a teen or young adult having to adjust to his newfound power. It would be too much progress for this character. It would disrupt the status quo. This is all because DC and Marvel constantly like to walk this tightrope of having every single story they produce both be a good starting point for beginners while also implying that every important event in a character's 70-year-long history is also valid. These characters need to be the same as they were 10 years ago and can't be permitted to receive their own conclusion. The overall setup of keeping these characters in a time loop in order to maintain their image is so infuriating since I know that none of the developments that occur will ever have a real lasting impact on a character that I place emotional investment in. Now you may be thinking, wait, but you started with Hal Jordan's resurrection, which is late in his timeline. Shouldn't you be grateful that the character was preserved by the time you first read Green Lantern? To this I would say not really, because the Hal I read was completely different from any other Hal. To go back onto the topic of comic book runs, every time a character is traded hands with a new team, he might as well be a completely new character. The new team will have a different voice, will focus on different themes, and will even provide a different tone. While I can certainly commend the idea of allowing different artists and creators to express their own interpretation of a superhero, I personally feel like the individual whose story I'm following might as well be a completely different book. Like, remember that one time Batman got killed? How about the second time he was killed? These two events are literally the same thing, and while I can make comments on the quality of the stories individually, I'd like to point to the fact that the concept of death literally doesn't matter because those two writers simply wanted the shock of Batman's death, but DC will never allow their biggest cash cow to be permanently inactive. DC and Marvel will never let any of these heroes die, but will instead allow them to be killed off if and only to add another headline in their ever-expanding Wikipedia article. And if something as life-changing as actual fucking death is of no consequence to Batman, then what the hell kind of drama could possibly keep me engaged? So, with all of these issues in mind, I think it would be only fair to talk about some of the things I wish DC and Marvel would adopt in terms of their practice of long-term storytelling. I wouldn't call these hard fixes because no piece of art is perfect, but these would be some nice improvements. I've ragged on long enough about how characters should get both progression and endings they deserve, but that doesn't mean I think their titles should end. I'm sure you've noticed how often comics like to push ideas of how characters can inherit certain mantles. The most obvious ones being Dick Grayson acting as Batman for a good while, Kyle Rayner filling in for Hal Jordan, or Jane Foster as Thor. The thing is, at these periods where superhero identity is briefly taken up by a different individual, it's often just there to keep telling stories surrounding that character's lore while they're absent. Usually, the original is off doing their own time travel shenanigans while they wait to get resurrected. The thing is that it'd be nice if it were more permanent. For instance, in the current DC Future State, the event is going quite hard in looking towards DC's near and possible future, even talking about new iterations of modern heroes, new Batman, new Aquaman, new Wonder Woman, and so on and so on. It's also rad that these iterations are very much taking more progressive ideals in regards to representation. And no, I don't care if you're offended by bi Superman or non-binary Flash. If they can still act as cool and respectable heroes in their own right, then you should have no real reason to complain. The only thing I care about is the fact that it implies a sense of genuine development in the DC lore. It's also nice that this can be done without killing off the entire cast or completely rewriting the franchise's history for the fifth time, but I am skeptical about any of these ideas gaining traction. I want to see John Kent adapt to being the new Superman, how he deals with the fact that he has to fill in the shoes of the strongest hero. I truly hope this will lead to companies adopting a mindset of allowing actual character growth and independent plots that don't have to rely on the baggage of staying true to over 70 years of obscure comic book history. I want this to be the case, but I know that unless it can sell, every idea of progressing superhero continuity might as well be another Elseworld story. The bottom line is that I want characters to invest in. I want to see them overcome their trials and tribulations and finally receive the ending they deserve, whether it ends in complete tragedy or in their happiness. The setting in the world can continue as well as the great works of heroes past go on to inspire a new age of heroes. For me, I don't want to keep up with the never-ending tide of relaunches, reboots, and reimaginings of stories I've already read. Hal Jordan's story ended for me, which is why I stopped reading comics.